Hello, everyone, and welcome to a lecture on the fungus among us. So, let's talk about the origin of fungus, their evolution, their phylogeny, their general character, blah, 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 the whole roadmap. So, let's get on it. The oldest evidence of fungus is about 360 million years ago. So, earliest fossil record evidence. And interestingly enough, this oldest record of fungus in the fossil record coincides with land plants. So, fungus are about as old as land plants, which is very fascinating. Fungus are much closer to animals than they are to plants. So, closer to animals than plants evolutionarily. And that's pretty cool. The lineages that led to animals and fungus, right? They diverged about 1 billion years ago. And then you have to go back another 500 million years to find the divergence for plants. So, even genetic information, fossil record info, everything reinforces that evidence. So, why do we have like the earliest fossil record evidence of 360 million years ago and genetic evidence pointing out the divergence of the fungal lineage 1 billion years ago? Well, probably because fungus are incredibly diverse organisms, and they include organisms like yeasts. Now, I'm not saying those old fungus were yeasts, but what's notable about yeast is that they are single-celled. So it's likely a lot of these ancient ancient fungus that are not in the fossil record are probably single-celled organisms, and those do not end up in the fossil record except under very, very specific conditions. So let's talk about the phylogeny of the fungi. The ancestor to the fungus was a single-celled aquatic flagellated organism. So its ancestor was single-celled aquatic and flagellated. Right? The clade that includes animals, fungi, and all the related protists that evolved from a unicellular flagellated ancestor is called opisthocons. The opisthocons are where we can place fungus, animals, and the closest protisted ancestors. So there you go. That's a pretty cool phylogenetic grouping, right? Protists, animals, and fungus. Not all protists, though, because there are protists more closely related to plants. So, protists are those ones that are all over the place. There is a fungal, there's a prokaryote, there is a protistan organism that's much more closely related to fungus than animals. It's called a nuclearid. And basically, it's a single-celled amoeba. So genetically speaking, the nuclearid protists, single-celled protist, and it's an amoeba. And it feeds on algae and bacteria. So it's a predator of algae and bacteria. So there you go. Animals, so fungo, that's the closest protistan fungal, the closest protistan to fungus. And if you'll recall back in my fungus lecture, the closest protistan to animals is the choanoflagellate, closest protistan to animals. So the group, the phylogenetic group, the Opisthocants, would include nuclearids, choanoflagellates, fungi, and animals. So, pretty cool. Since they both fungus and animals share unrelated single cellular ancestors, it's likely multicellularity was sort of a convergent, independently evolved trait. So I don't know if you can say multicellularity is convergent, but it evolved independently in each group. So that's pretty cool. Boop. All right. What are the basic characteristics of a fungus? They are heterotrophs. So they cannot generate their own nutrients. They must absorb nutrients. They absorb nutrients. Most are decomposers. Decomposers secrete digestive enzymes into the substrate. Right? And they can break down a lot of stuff that a lot of other living things cannot. So, for instance, they can digest cellulose. So they are an important organism in the decomposition of plants. So that's pretty cool. Then they absorb the molecules released. So not too terrible. They're all heterotrophs. Most are decomposers, secreting their digestive enzymes into the environment, into the substrate, for instance, soil, or even just logs that are going to be turned into soil when they're broken down. And they digest, the secreted chemicals digest and break down the structures in the substrate, and then they are able to absorb it directly from the substrate. This here secretes digestive enzymes into the substrate and absorb the digested macromolecules. This is the basic function of parasitoid funguses too. So parasitic fungi also release digestive enzymes into their substrate. But in this case, the substrate is other organisms. We'll be mentioning chytrid fungus, which is something that definitely needs to go extinct. It's an amphibian parasite. And it digests their skin. And if you think that sounds bad right now, you should know that amphibians are cutaneous respirators. What that means is most of their oxygen exchange occurs through capillary beds under their very thin layers of skin. So when chytrid fungus digests amphibian skin, it actually suffocates the amphibians to death. So, screw chytrid fungus. It needs to go extinct, man. All right. The other big characteristic of fungus is that they have a cell wall. And that cell wall is made of chitin. Chitin is the same polysaccharide that makes up arthropod exoskeletons, like crab shells and insect exoskeletons and such. This is one of the pieces of evidence that shows fungus are more closely related to animals than plants, which is pretty cool. So, not too terrible. Let's talk about the basic anatomy of a fungus among us. So, first, when we look at a fungus, you are generally not looking at the majority of the fungus, especially when you're looking at a mushroom. So, the mushroom is a mass that's basically the stalk of a mushroom. So let's go basics here. First, most of a fungus is going to be in the form of hyphae. Hyphae are long, filamentous, often one cell thick, like let's say 1 to 3 cells thick. And they are strands. And basically, these hyphae are branching around in the substrate, branch through the substrate, and these are what are actually doing the whole metabolism stuff. These are what's secreting the enzymes and absorbing nutrients. So, when you look at a fungus, the majority of a fungus is its hyphae. When a mushroom dies back, you are not seeing the death of the fungus, you're seeing the death of the mycelia and the basidia. So, the mycelium is an interwoven mass of hyphae. So it's an interwoven mass of hyphae. Oh, whoops, I'm using the wrong terminology here. Basidia. Okay, so I need to stop recording these at 2 a.m. But it's 2:36, so I successfully did not record this at 2 a.m. Okay, so mycelia are the interwoven mass of hyphae that are in the substrate. So, it is not the mushroom. It is the mass of hyphae, right? Pretty cool. The mycelium is haploid, which we'll talk about. We're going to talk about their alternation of generations. Not like plants, it's their own weird thing. So, then we have the actual fruiting body, which is the mushroom. So when you think fungus, what you're probably thinking of, like if I say mushroom, you're thinking of the fruiting body of that fungus. So this is the actual dense mass. Basically, you just get enough hyphae to make up an actual thick, massive structure that's visible. right? Whereas an individual hypha, like this picture here in the right, we have hyphae, and then this is a human hair. So you can see hyphae are extremely thin and filamentous and branching out. So to get enough of them to actually create something macroscopic like a mushroom is a truly dizzying amount of structures. That's pretty cool. Now, fungus do something funny. The cells that make up the mushroom, the grand majority of the mushroom, are what we call dikaryotic. So they have dikaryotic cells in the fruiting body. These are produced through hyphal union. So I'll just say hyphae union, hyphal being like, the proper grammatical term. Now, you might think, wouldn't two cells coming together be fertilization? And the reason it's not is because when two hyphae fuse, so here's one cell of a hyphae, and here's another cell of a hyphae, and here's the fused cell, right? So here's nucleus 1, and then here's nucleus 2, and then in our fused fruiting body cell, we have nucleus 1 and 2. So there are two nuclei. So these fruiting bodies are binucleate cells. So it is not fertilization. Fertilization is an extremely brief moment in the life cycle of a mushroom. And it's going to happen, if it happens, in the microscopic spore-producing structure called the basidia. So, microscopic spore-producing structures. As you'll recall, spores in the plant world are haploid. Spores in the fungus world are haploid. So fertilization is going to have to occur before spore production. So the basidia are the microscopic spore-producing structures, and they are in what you'd refer to as the gills of a mushroom, if you've ever looked at the underside of a mushroom. So let's talk about our alternation of generations. It's not generally referred to as alternation of generations because that's kind of a plant thing. But it is going to be something that works as an analogy because there's a haploid stage, there's a diploid stage, and there's the heterokaryotic stage, the dikaryotic stage. Okay, so first off, fungi can reproduce asexually. In asexual reproduction, right, we just have spore production via mitosis. So we have, here's our haploid spores. We'll start here. And our haploid spores germinate, and they grow the mycelium through mitosis. And then the mycelium itself produces spore-producing structures, and then those produce spores and germination, and we have our little asexual cycle off to the left. So, the mycelia, the haploid mycelia, produce their own spores. So they undergo mitosis and they produce haploid spores. And then whoop, right back to haploid mycelia. Right? So in this sort of asexual life cycle here, it's all mitosis, baby. There's not even worry about fertilization or anything like that. So that's one thing fungi are capable of running. There's about 200,000 species of fungi that reproduce asexually only. Obligate asexuals. Mostly molds. Tons of molds. Okay. Then there's another type of asexual reproduction called budding. Our big example of this is yeasts. In budding, a parent cell produces the offspring fused to the parent, like a little bud. Better illustrated than just sort of explained like this. So here's my parental cell, right? Here's my single-celled fungus of a yeast, and it's going to reproduce. And what it starts to do is it starts to build off a new cell wall, and then it will enlarge that, and then we'll have mitosis. So we have sort of an unequal division of cells. The new cell is smaller than the parental cell. So the parental cell keeps most of its cytoplasm. So really, the only effective way to do this is budding, if you're going to have this unequal thing. And then it just continues to grow on the parent until it reaches adult size, and then it may spring loose, like it may break of the bond, or it may just stay attached. It depends. But anyway, you have unequal, so mitosis produces unequal cytoplasms. And essentially we have what you can think of as the parent, which is the one that gets the bigger cytoplasm, and the offspring, which is the one that gets the smaller cytoplasm. These are actually two clones of the original cell. This is a product of mitosis, but because of the way budding works, it's easy to think parent-offspring. So, lots of single-celled fungi do this. All right. Now let's talk about sex and fungus. Now, first off, this is missing an M. So, plasmogamy. All right. Let's talk about mating types and fungus. Okay, so first off, in fungus, we talk about mating types. You will notice there's no sperm and there's no egg. In other words, there's no big versus little gamete. Because there's no real gametes. And because there's no big versus little, there's no egg and there's no sperm. And because there's no egg and there's no sperm, there's no female and there's no male. So in fungal mating types, the two that can get together are the plus type and the minus type. A plus and a plus cannot get together, and a minus cannot get together. A plus and a minus type can get together. So here's some hyphal cells with the plus nuclei, and here's some hyphal cells with a minus nuclei. And you have a union of hyphae, hyphal union, in which the two hyphae connect, and then you get plasmogamy. Plasmogamy, the cytoplasm fuses. Or really, if I wanted to be super specific about it, the plasma membrane. So, this is plasmogamy, fusion of the plasma membranes, so two cells into one cell. However, it is one cell with two nuclei. Plasmogamy produces dikaryotic cells. And because plus and minus are different, which corresponds to the Latin prefix hetero, these are also heterokaryotic cells. So, in sexual reproduction in fungi, you have a plus strain hyphae and a minus strain hyphae, and they fuse at plasmogamy, and you produce dikaryotic cells that are most specifically and correctly, because this is sexual reproduction, and we have two different mating types in the same cell, heterokaryotic cells. So, we have plasmogamy. We have a heterokaryotic cell, often abbreviated as 1N plus 1N. Right? Because it's not diploid, it's heterokaryotic. Right? We can't say 2N because there's two separate nuclei. But just before it's time for meiosis, we have to have karyogamy. So, the plus and minus nuclei move together, and their nuclear membranes fuse, and we have our truly diploid nucleus. And the term right here for nuclear fusion is karyogamy. So, karyogamy. Oh, careful there. Come here. Come here. There we go. Let's get all knotted, shall we? There we go. So, karyogamy is nuclear fusion. It's when the nuclei actually fuse together. And that's when you actually have a diploid nucleus. And now we have a diploid cell, which will immediately undergo meiosis to get haploid spores. Right? So the actual diploid stage of a fungus does not persist very long, and it basically only occurs in those basidia. So, ta-da! Fungi are weird, and I'm here for it. Yes, I am. I am here for the weird. Okay. So, you have the spores. They germinate. They produce the mycelium. Here's, let's say, plus. And then over here, off from the edge, comes in the mycelium from minus. And you get plasmogamy, and you have a plus-minus cell in their heterokaryotic stage. And then you have karyogamy, in which you have your single plus-minus nucleus. And then you have meiosis, giving you spores. It's a weird one, although arguably not as terribly complex yet as plants. So, not so awful here. Ta-da! This little diagram down here does a good job indicating what's going on in the basidium. So lower right here, we have our dikaryotic cell. We have, that's a product of plasmogamy. We have karyogamy to get a zygote. And then we get our basidial cell here that has all 4 spores in there. And then that basidial cell, the basidium, buds off and creates a bud for each spore. And now you have basidiospores. Which we'll go into later, I believe. Anyway, the ecological role of fungi. So I already talked about the fact that they are major decomposers, right? So there's a lot of symbiosis in the world of fungus. So there's a lot of mutualism. So there's 3 different kinds of symbiosis. Mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. And this is all about what's happening to the host. In other words, in mutualism, they both benefit. Right? In commensalism, one benefits, the symbiote benefits, and the host is unaffected. And in parasitism, the symbiote benefits, and the host is harmed. So, in mutualism, both the symbiote and the host benefit from the relationship. In commensalism, the symbiote benefits and the host is unharmed. And in parasitism, the host is harmed while the symbiote benefits. Okay. So, that's symbiosis. So when I say symbiosis, I don't mean it's good. by definition. So then we have pathogen. Pathogens are disease-causing. So pathogens disrupt homeostasis in a reliable set of symptoms, causing a reliable and sort of constant set of symptoms. So a disease. So a disruption of homeostasis that's harmful, and every time the pathogen infects, it causes the same, set of symptoms. When it comes down to it, the difference between pathogen and parasite often comes down to the size, right? So we'll often use pathogen to describe microscopic organisms and parasite to describe macroscopic organisms. Or sometimes we use parasite for eukaryotes and pathogen for prokaryotes. It kind of depends. So this is not a hard and fast rule like so many things in biology. It is fuzzy. So sometimes it's eukaryotes, sometimes parasite is macroscopic, and pathogen is microscopic. I've seen both. So I wouldn't use either of these as a hard and fast definition of whether or not to use parasite or pathogen. So pathogens cause disease. So getting ticks may suck, but having a tick sucking your blood is not a disease. We're ignoring tick-borne viruses. So just being parasited doesn't mean you have a disease. It has to actually cause a disease to full-on be a pathogen. So where I've seen this get fuzzy is good old-fashioned malaria, because it's a little eukaryotic plasmodium that causes malaria. So I've seen it called the malarial parasite, and I've seen it called the malarial pathogen, and it's kind of both. So there you go. Let's talk about fungi that kind of illustrate these relationships. Whoops. Okay, so cool examples of these relationships at work. Let's talk about our textbook mutualist relationship with fungi and algae. So, lichen is a mutualism betwixt fungus and algae. The fungus provides protection and a microclimate that allows algae to survive. Right? The way the fungus grows, it creates this fun little cage, which is able to actually maintain the humidity required for algae to survive. So it creates a small, humid microclimate that allows algae to survive. So fungus bring protection and the microclimate, right? Algae bring the food. There was this ancient mnemonic that I used to know. So Freddie Fungus took a lichen to Alice Algae. So Freddie Fungus took a lichen to Alice Algae. And he said, "Darling, if you do the cooking, I'll build the house." That is some 1940s ass mnemonic right there. But, it is what it is. It's catchy at least. Uh, let's see. Here's another cool symbiotic relationship. This is actually algae, so not a fungus. So sloth fur is actually kind of fascinating. Sloth fur is grooved, so it has a little groove in it. And that groove is an environment to some very specific some sloth-specific symbiotic algae. They grow only in the grooves in the sloth fur. And what happens is that groove provides a microclimate for the algae, and the sloth likes to hang out up in the canopy where there's a lot more access to light than the forest floor. And then the algae turns the sloth green, so it provides a camouflaging effect. So that's kind of cool. Okay. Commensalism. A lot of epiphytes are commensal. Epiphytes are plants that grow on the surface of other plants. So, orchids are epiphytic. Spanish moss is epiphytic. Spanish moss is not moss. It's a flowering plant, so that's wild. Parasitism, right? I just mentioned fleas, mites, ticks, tapeworms, right? All sorts of organisms. When you're talking about parasites, you tend to list off eukaryotes, the malarial parasite, and then pathogens. Oh, take your pick. So, then we can talk about obligatory versus facultative symbiosis. So lichen over here is great because it's fungus, and this is the fungus lecture. And also, it's a cool example of obligatory symbiosis. If you're obligated to go to a party, you have no choice. You have to go. You were at the coffee shop and you saw them and they said, hey, come to our party. And you were like, oh, now you're obligated because you politely said sure. Anyway, so obligatory symbiosis is literally neither can survive without the other. So no survive without each other. It's like the last third of a rom-com where they come back together, I guess, and they deliver the speech. Anyway, lichen is obligatory. Facultative symbiosis is where they can survive without the relationship. So, not too terrible. A lot of commensals are going to be facultative. So an orchid, an epiphytic orchid does not have to grow on its host. You can move it to like any other surface you want. You see orchids growing in pots. As long as you provide the right substrate that doesn't kill the epiphytic, anchors, then it's fine. So a lot of epiphytic plants are facultative symbiotes. So there you go. So fungus are often found in symbiotic relationships. All of them. So lichen is an awesome mutualistic fungi. There are commensal fungi. So a lot, for instance, there's specific strains of yeast that grow on human skin, and they, They live on your skin and they have a good time, and they're yeast, and you are unaffected. So there's commensal yeasts on the outside of your skin. Then there's parasitic fungi. I mentioned those jerk chytrid fungi. Screw those. I hate them so much. And pathogenic fungi, well, a lot of the parasitic fungi are also pathogenic, in which when they infect a host, they produce a reliable set of symptoms. All right. Decomposition in the environment. Fungi are huge decomposers. What can they decompose? Well, they are a major source of decomposition of cellulose and lignin. Cellulose is the plant cell wall structure, generally indigestible, and they can decompose cellulose into component pieces, and then even more impressive, they can decompose lignin. As you learned in the plant tissues lecture, lignin is packed into the cell walls of I think the sclerenchyma, but don't quote me on it. So lignin is packed into those, and it creates an even tougher cell. So lignin's even harder to break down than cellulose, and fungi are important decomposers of lignin and cellulose. So not only do they decompose like anything, they can decompose some of the toughest things in nature. So when they decompose these things, they return carbon and nitrogen and other elements to the soil. So, right, a dead thing can be thought of as having nutrients locked in it, right? A structure, a dead plant, let's go with a plant, is still storing all its nutrients. Here, nutrients meaning the macromolecules that make up the plant. And you can decompose and get carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. back into the soil. So they are important parts of multiple cycles, right? You can talk about the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and decomposers are huge, important parts of all those cycles. I wish you had eyelids, and then I can tell if you were taking a nap. All right, here's a cool mutualistic relationship between fungi and plants, the mycorrhizae. We mentioned this a hot minute ago, but these are the hyphae attached to roots. So not only do you have a plant root with all its root hairs, but then coming off those root hairs are the hyphae of the mycorrhizae. And if the root hairs massively increase surface area for absorption of water and nutrients, well, then you better believe them hyphae even greater expansion. So, hyphae and root hairs and root. And so these are the mycorrhizal hyphae. And basically they massively increase surface area for H2O and mineral absorption. And being a true mutualistic relationship, this is good for the plants, right? So what do the fungus get? The fungus get phloem access. So they're fed by the phloem. How important is this? 90% of all plants, not just angiosperms, 90% of all plants have their symbiotic mycorrhizae. There we go. How important is this? The hyphae are in the seed. Right? So mycorrhizae are present in the seed. That's how important it is. Okay. Endophytes, which is kind of a fascinating one. Endophytes live in the intercellular spaces betwixt plant cells. So epiphytes live on the surface of plants. Fungal endophytes live in the intercellular spaces between plant cells. So that's kind of cool. Endophytes often produce defensive alkaloids. So when we talked all about those plant defenses, a lot of those are synthesizing. So endophytic fungus aid in alkaloid synthesis. If you're going to live here, then you're going to do some of the work. We're talking nicotine, cocaine, caffeine, D-lysergic acid, right? So the symbiotic relationship allows them to take on some of that work, which is kind of cool. Endophytes in the cacao trees help prevent plant pests. In ryegrass, this is ryegrass here. The endophytes actually produce enough alkaloids to significantly reduce pest accumulation on it. So the plants without the endophytes over here with these aphids, they're getting nailed, whereas with the endophytes, the fungus are producing enough alkaloid defenses to help out. So many endophytes grow into the ovule and colonize the seeds, just like the mycorrhizae. So the endophytes get their guaranteed transport generation to generation. So the mycorrhizae are in there in the seed hanging out. And then also the endophytes are in there in the seed hanging out with the embryonic plant. So that's kind of hilarious. The seed is a dispersal mechanism for plants and symbiotic fungi. All right, lichens. I went through the whole symbiotic nature of lichen, but what's cool about lichen is that they are often the primary colonizers. They're the first life to appear in a harsh environment. harsh or new environments. The the fungus that makes up lichens is often incredibly durable. So that's pretty cool. Uh, so the fungal hyphae can actually get into the rock and begin the incredibly slow process of breaking rock down into smaller chunks to allow more things to live there. That's not, fungus aren't the things, like the lichens are not the thing doing that, but they are an important part of that. So they're the primary colonizers of an ecosystem because the symbiotic fungus in the lichen is incredibly durable, especially in those ones living in extremely harsh environments. You've probably seen lichen and tried to pull it off of something and failed utterly. It's been almost rock-like in consistency. Those fungi can be pretty tough. So fungi, the lichens are bioindicators. Basically, lichens absorb their nutrients from air and rain. So if you want to know whether or not air pollution or water pollution is starting to infect an ecosystem, look at how much lichen there are. For instance, lichen are almost absent from cities. And the reason for that is generally car exhaust and industry. The air pollution associated with cities. So if the lichens start to disappear, something's going wrong. Here's fruticose lichen, named because it kind of looks, like a big stalk that has fruit on it. Like there's a big fruiting bodies type structure. Then we have foliose lichen because the lichen actually kind of looks like leaves, foliage. And then you have crustose lichen, literally crusty lichen. There we go. And here in purple is our fungus. So the purple, the dark purple is our fungal cells, the fungal hyphae. And then in bright blue, we have our algal cells nested quite firm inside all of that fungus, creating that perfect microclimate for algae. Okay, continuing on. Leafcutter Attini ants are kind of a really cool symbiosis, show us cool symbiosis with fungus because leafcutter ants, they go around, they find leaves, and they snip off pieces that they can carry them, that they can carry. Oh, geez, 320. And they carry them off to their farms. And basically, they use decomposing leaves to keep a fungus garden. Right? So the ants eat the fungus, and the ants eat this fungus, and they just continually bring leaves so they can maintain enough fungus to, keep the colony going. So they eat the fungus, and so they have to, much like humans, farm enough to eat and keep enough for coming months, years, etc. So they keep a good garden. And what's fascinating about these leafcutter ants, these Atini ant fungus gardens, is a lot of these fungus can't survive outside the garden. They can't survive without the ants. Which means this is, remember there are two kinds of symbiosis. One where they can't live without the other, and one where they can live without the other. So many of these Atini garden funguses are dependent on the Atini ants. So obligate symbiosis. Not too terrible. Okay, continuing on, 12 of 16, let's talk about pathogenic and parasitic fungi. Fungi are so close to animals that it's often kind of difficult to treat fungal diseases. The reason for this being that fungus are eukaryotes, right? So antibiotics, which treat bacteria, they have multiple mechanisms. They shut down RNA synthesis. They shut down ribosome fusion. They shut down the ability of mRNA to bind to ribosomes. They shut down the ability to make the peptidoglycan cell wall, right? So RNA synthesis is, the mechanisms in bacteria are specific to those prokaryotes. The mechanism, they're ribosomes, right? They are specific to prokaryotes. You can shoot someone up with a whole lot of chemical that shuts down bacterial ribosomes, and it will not shut down your own ribosomes. Whereas if you shoot someone up with a whole lot of chemical to shut down fungal ribosomes, you'll shut down your own ribosomes too. So it can be very difficult to treat fungal diseases. Another reason it's difficult to treat fungal diseases is because fungi have cell walls. So some fungal pathogens don't absorb things very easily. So let's talk about some of these fungal pathogens and parasites. Armillaria species. Right? Armillaria kills deciduous and conifer trees. Basically, it causes root rot. And then all you need then is all you need then is a strong breeze, and it will cause the tree to fall over. Let me check a thing. Okay, so there's question as to whether an armillaria, there's question as to whether an armillaria colony covering 8.9 square kilometers in Oregon is the largest ant organism in the world. So is it the largest organism in the world? Maybe. But we can't show that all the hyphae of that 8.9 square kilometer armillaria is connected. So it could be all interconnected, creating one humongous 8.9 square kilometer armillaria, or it could be multiple colonies of armillaria. And what are you going to do to prove that? So maybe. Aspergillus flavus. Aspergillus flavus produces aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is a carcinogen. And Aspergillus flavus colonizes corn, peanuts, and cotton. And because aflatoxin is carcinogenic and it can damage the kidneys and the nervous system, there are legal limits. Like you have to test for the presence of aflatoxin, and then there's legal limits on how much aflatoxin contamination can be present. Because once again, there's a safe concentration and a harmful concentration of every chemical in the world. There's a safe concentration of cyanide you can ingest. So there are safe concentrations of aflatoxin you can ingest. So if you test a crop and it's positive for aflatoxin, you're going to have to test the, limits, how much aflatoxin you have before you know whether or not you have to toss the entire crop. I feel a snake. So, I see a snake. Snake power. Okay, let's talk about human parasites / pathogens. Candida, so thrush and yeast infections. You know how I talked about there's all that commensal yeast on your body? Well, Candida albicans and other species on your skin. Thumbs up. Right? Under your skin, or more specifically for thrush and yeast infection in mucous membranes. Thumbs down. When it's in the mucous membranes of your mouth and your tongue, albicans is the one I remember, but it's more than that. So, Candida species. Right? Mouth and tongue, you have thrush. And then the vaginal mucosa, you have a yeast infection. Things have to go very wrong for you to be getting thrush or yeast infections. Your saliva is pretty darn effective at killing any kind of candida that get into your mouth. It's not like no candida ever get into your mouth, right? You have saliva. You're constantly cycling your saliva through your body, and you have immune functions, but mostly, honestly, your saliva there. So something has to be going pretty wrong for you to make your mouth and your cheeks there susceptible to Candida albicans colonization. And the vaginal mucosa can only be colonized by yeasts if the pH of the vagina gets near neutral. So the pH of the skin is ever so slightly below neutral, so very, very mildly acidic. And then the vaginal mucus secreted by the vaginal mucosa is much, much more acidic. Candida albicans literally cannot survive the acidic pH of the vagina. So you have to actually have a vagina reach that near neutral pH before Candida albicans can colonize it. and then you end up with a yeast infection. So in general, something else has gone wrong. Thrush and yeast infections generally, either you've done something very wrong or it's a secondary infection to a different pathogen that's weakened those defenses there. So with regards to you've done something very wrong, douching was the cause of a ton of yeast infections, which, if you only know douche is an insult, good for you. But once upon a time, you'd buy a product that was a gentle cleansing solution, and the douche was the squeeze bottle that you flush your vaginal cavity out with. And it was very good at doing harm. And that's all it did. It harmed you. And the biggest thing it would do was bring the pH near neutral, and then you'd get a yeast infection. But hey, marketing companies way back in the day loved to market it as, you're gross and you smell bad, so douche yourself. That was a weird divergence. So let's get back to fungus. All right. There is actually there are fungal species that can infiltrate the lungs and cause pneumonia. So, for instance, Aspergillus fumigatus. Right? If this airborne fungus manages to actually colonize your lungs, right? It's airborne spores, and it's not airborne spores in bad environments. It's airborne spores everywhere. You are constantly breathing in the spores for Aspergillus fumigatus. But they do nothing. Like, your immune system takes care of it. The mucus elevator takes care of it. All your different immune cells, they murder that stuff. It can do nothing to you unless you're immunocompromised. So if you're immunocompromised, man, green does not appear super great right now. We're going to go back to red. If you're immunocompromised, right, then Aspergillus can actually colonize your lungs. So amongst the immunocompromised out there, worldwide, it causes 600,000 deaths annually. So the particular pneumonia it causes kills 600,000 immunocompromised people annually worldwide. So, I mean, 8 billion people or 7 billion people or whatever we're at right now. It's a small fraction, but, I wouldn't call it small. Anyway, athlete's foot and nail fungus. There are multiple species, and basically those parasites do really well in extremely humid environments. So if your skin is really wet constantly, it can cause breaks in the skin, and the humidity can allow it to colonize that area. So if you're doing regular heavy athletic work wearing socks and you don't wash your socks a ton and you sweat in them constantly, congratulations, you've created the perfect climate for that athlete's foot fungus and the nail bed funguses to colonize it. And you get scaly, peeling skin. Weirdly enough, Head and Shoulders, the dandruff preventing shampoo, is one of the simplest remedies for athlete's foot and nail fungus. You just rub that in and leave it on there for like 30 minutes and then wash it. And you do that, every day for a while. Okay, so now let's talk about the thing I hate the most. There's lots of things I hate the most, but I love frogs. And Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, it pisses me off. That's a mouthful. Chytrid fungus, right? You see chytrium, you don't have to memorize the rest of it. Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, chytrium, chytrid fungus. So what happened was, we often call this BD because that's a mouthful. Chytrid fungus, BD fungus, was an Asian amphibian parasite. And the amphibians over in Asia, they have mechanisms to deal with it. It doesn't go all about murdering them constantly. But it's gone worldwide. And it is causing a massive problem. So, like, it's causing 200 extinctions a year. Extinctions. Basically, any frogs outside its native range, they have no defense against chytrid. And so it gets in their skin and it wipes out their skin and they suffocate to death. And its spores spread in water, right? It's not like the water even destroys it. So the sharp-snouted torrent frog was driven extinct exclusively by Batridia chytrid fungus. So, the last captive animal died in 1995 at a zoo, and it died of chytrid fungal infection. The gastric brooding frog, it's strongly suspected that chytrid killed it. The southern day frog went extinct, right? I hate it. I hate it so much. So it interferes with O2 exchange. And that's because, as I said a while back, amphibians are largely cutaneous respirators. And this is especially true of your aquatic frogs. So any frogs that are largely aquatic, like my leopard frog over here, they they are cutaneous respirators. They breathe through their skin. It's why they need water and why being out of the water kills them rather quickly. Because they need wet skin in order to keep there's all these capillary beds just under the thinnest layer of skin. And it's very easy to lose water through that thin layer of skin out of those capillary beds and dehydrate and die. And when chytrid destroys the skin, they dehydrate and die. They suffocate and dehydrate, and they die. And it's awful, and we should drive that entire fungus extinct. Ecological repercussions be damned. It's a pathogen. I'm okay. We should give it the smallpox treatment. We eradicated smallpox. We should eradicate chytrid. Man, I love frogs. Okay, on to something actually much cooler, cordyceps. If you like The Last of Us, you are probably aware of the cordyceps fungus. The cordyceps fungus is a parasitoid. It is an arthropod parasitoid. So nearly any arthropod has a parasitic cordyceps. There's tons of different cordyceps out there, each cordyceps corresponding to its own particular host, right? And the wild thing about cordyceps is that the hyphae reach the brain. And when they reach the brain, when the hyphae infiltrate the brain, they cause a behavioral change. And that behavioral change is to seek out the optimum environment for spreading cordyceps. This sounds rather complicated, but it often follows very simple rules. So, for instance, ants are driven to climb upside down. So, an ant, right? So, here's all my ants. And they're all walking along the undergrowth. And, here's a nice background tree. Whatever. I don't know, man. There. Whatever. It's a leaf. I don't know what it is. They're ants. They're small. And then here's my cordyceps infected ant. And it literally its behavioral change is climb upside down. And by simply climbing upside down and then biting with all the force it can muster, right? It can die and its jaws will remain anchored. And then the fruiting body grows out of the head and then spores rain down. So it's not like we're causing huge, complicated, sentient fungal changes here. It's not like the fungus is now processing the environment and knowing what to do. These are often simple rules. Climb upside down, bite. It's still wild that the hyphal infiltration causes climb upside down and bite. So that's kind of cool. So, especially since climbing is maladaptive. Climbing bad. Basically, it exposes ants to predators. So it is definitely the fungus causing this shift. I don't think this works.
Incredibly, 80% of all insects live in jungles.
I don't know how that audio is going to work.
Few are more successful than the ants. There can be 8 million individuals.
I'm going to watch this.
Because it's good. But jungle ants don't have it all their own way.
It's in its brain.
These bullet ants are showing some worrying symptoms. Spores from a parasitic fungus called cordyceps have infiltrated their bodies and their minds.
So you can see it's climbing up a branch.
Its infected
brain
directs this ant upwards. Then, utterly disorientated, it grips a stem with its mandibles. Those afflicted that are discovered by the workers are quickly taken away and dumped far away from the colony. It seems extreme, but this is the reason why.
And now, the fruiting bodies are growing.
Like something out of science fiction, the fruiting body of the cordyceps erupts from the ant's head. It can take 3 weeks to grow, and when finished, the deadly spores will burst from its tip. Then, any ant in the vicinity will be in serious risk of death. The fungus is so virulent, it can wipe out whole colonies of ants. And it's not just ants that fall victim to this killer.
There's a grasshopper
There
cordyceps.
are literally thousands of different types of cordyceps fungi, and remarkably, each specializes on just one species.
There's another grasshopper cordyceps. But that's a different species of grasshopper, so it's a different species of cordyceps. I think they've got a spider cordyceps here too. So that's a something cordyceps, but I have no idea what that sucker was. There's a moth cordyceps. That one's really pretty.
But these attacks do have a positive effect on the jungle's diversity, since
There's a
parasites like
stick
these
insect.
stop any one group of animal getting the upper hand. The more numerous a species becomes, the more likely it will be attacked by its nemesis, a cordyceps fungus.
I have no idea if the audio's coming through, but the narrator was basically just saying that cordyceps serves a function in population control. Cordyceps infections go up when populations spike. So it helps to keep populations in check. All right. Slide 15 of 16, people. Bioremediation is an example. So this is practical uses of fungi, which is how humans can use fungus. So there is bioremediation using fungus to break down industrial waste. Let's go back to red. Or not. To break down industrial waste. Right? Food, beer, right? We make beer with various types of yeasts. We make wine with various types of yeasts, the yeasts that grow on the surface of the grapes. When you smash the grapes, you're opening up all of the contents of the grapes and making the juice available to the yeast that are growing outside on the surface of the grapes. So the fungal yeast grow on the outside of the fruit. So smashing it allows the fungus to, ferment the fruit juice. So beer, wine, bread, and cheese. These are all fungal products, right? And then in medicine, penicillin. Penicillin is a product of the fungus Penicillium. And Penicillium produces penicillin, which is a potent disruptor of bacterial metabolism. It shuts down bacteria extremely well. When humans first found penicillin, we found you could see mortality rates, they had been hovering with industrialization at a certain level, and then you have penicillin, and then boom, right? It crashed. So the onset of antibiotics is a big deal. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. There's other cyclosporin is a fungal antibiotic. Cephalosporin, those are fungal-derived antibiotics. So pretty cool. So not just penicillin. So we have fungus-derived antibiotics. With the term antibiotic specifically meaning kills bacteria. Penicillin does nothing against viruses. So that sucks. Woo! Just comics. Will make athlete's foot disappear. Oh no. It appears to be a severe case of athlete's body. The downsides of living in a shoe. There was a little old lady who lived in a shoe. And the downsides of lecturing till 3:52 in the morning. I hate you, but also I love you. Good night.